Okay, so we're talking about measures of development. And we said that is income a good measure of development? Well, that depends. We already kind of look at the last video and kind of there are a variety of evaluations there, but one is it depends on what you mean by income and which one you're measuring. So there are two things that we need to bear in mind here. So one, is are we talking about domestic income or product, or are we talking about national? So on the one hand, you've got GDP or GDI, whatever you prefer. On the other hand, you've got GNP, GNI, and these are going to give you often these are going to give you the same number, but for some countries they won't. So what's the difference? So domestic, is income. If we look at it, income generated by, if we look at it from a UK perspective, UK-based factors of production. So it doesn't matter who owns them, as long as they're geographically in the UK, we count all of the economic activity that's created by those factors of production. Whereas GNP is income generated by UK owned factors of production, regardless of where they are in the world. So fine. So what differences are there? Why might one be more than the other? I mean, a good example is the presence of multinationals. So if we took, here's a very bad map of the UK. Sorry, Scotland. Imagine we think about the profits of three factories, A, B, C, and here's very bad, even worse, Japan over here, and D. And we look at the profits, from each of those four factories, When we look at the profits from when we want to count domestic income, we would count the profit. So GDP, the profits of A, B, and C would be part of GDP, because they're all physically located in the UK. Because the profits of C aren't going to stay here, they're going to be paid back to Japan. So what GNP does is it says, well, we can't count C anymore. So when we look at A, B, C, we've got to eliminate C and say, well, those profits aren't going to stay in the UK. But of course, factory D, based in Japan, that's going to pay its profits back to the UK. So therefore, in GNP, you would have A, B, and D. So to convert from one to the other, then what you say is the best way of explaining the difference between these is to kind of say, well, GNI or P or whatever, is equal to GDP plus any income from abroad. Sometimes it's called property income, minus income paid abroad. So if you take two countries so for the most part, these tend to be fairly similar for most countries. But if we look at two countries where that's not true, and you look at Ireland, because it has very low corporation tax, it has a very, very large number of multinationals that have their headquarters in Ireland. So its GDP is very big, because there's lots of multinationals. But then they then pay their profits. They then repatriate their profits. Those profits are paid back to other countries, which means that their GNI is much lower. So let's suppose we have a GDP of 500 billion euros. 100 billion are repatriated, so their GNI is only 400 billion euros. If we look at Tajikistan, somewhere like that, the point about Tajikistan is that a lot of its workforce isn't actually in Tajikistan at all. So it has a relatively low GDP because all of those workers are actually in Russia. Not all of them, but there's a significant number of Tajiki workers who are in Russia. So therefore, they pay. They send remittances are paid back to Tajikistan, which means that their GNI is much higher than their GDP. So there's a difference between GD and GN that you need to be aware of. The other thing that we also need to be aware of is you'll often see this idea, especially when you look at the Human Development Index, you'll see this idea of GNI per capita at PPP. And PPP stands for Purchasing Power Parity, which doesn't help very much because it doesn't really explain itself. Ugh. Purchasing Power Parity. So what does that do? What it's trying to do is its key role is it adjusts for issues or problems with nominal exchange rates. So, and this all comes from the fact that we're trying to convert incomes into dollars, generally US dollars, to be able to compare them. And one way of doing that is to take your GDP and use today's exchange rate, or GNI or whatever, and use today's exchange rate to turn it into US dollars. But then that's assuming that the exchange rate actually reflects the true cost of living inside your country. If we take the day of the Brexit vote, the day before, UK GDP around that time was somewhere in the region of 30,000 quid per person. Before the Brexit vote, a pound was $1.50. The next day, a pound was $1.35. So if you just take nominal exchange rates, then the day before, GDP per capita in the UK is 45,000. For the simplicity of doing numbers, I'm going to change that to 130. The day after, it's $39,000. But that's of course nonsense. There's no way in which suddenly my GDP, my living standards are $6,000 worse just because the exchange rate changed. I mean, I don't buy that much from the US. I mean, most people aren't affected. I mean, obviously it has some effect, but oil prices and so on. But most people aren't directly affected in that way. So what we need is some way of saying, well, what is a fair exchange rate between pounds and dollars that reflects actually what £30,000 is really worth inside the UK? And that's where purchasing power parity comes in. So what it does is it says, well, let's take a representative international basket of goods and services. So what we'll do is we'll take £30,000, and we're going to say, well, what can I get for £30,000? I'll buy a representative set of goods and services. So I'll get food, I'll maybe buy transport, I might get a car, fuel, things that are internationally standard, and then what I'll do is say, okay, I have this amount of food, this amount of transport, this amount of fuel, and then I'll then go to the US and say, how much would this cost me to buy in the US? And then say, okay, let's suppose that when I buy exactly the same food, housing, fuel, and so on, let's suppose that cost me $42,000, suppose. Then I'd say, well, okay, the fair exchange rate then, is £1 equals $1.40. And that is what we would call the PPP, or purchasing power parity exchange rate. Sometimes I call that the goods to goods exchange rate. What it's trying to do is to say, what is it that your local currency actually buys? How many dollars would it cost you to buy the same quantity, the same amount of goods and services as it would in your own country? So a purchasing power parity exchange rate, what does it do? A PPP exchange rate, it adjusts for volatility in nominal exchange rates, and the nominal exchange rate is just today's exchange rate, to find a fair exchange rate which reflects the purchasing power inside a country of the local currency. So which reflects the actual purchasing power of a local currency. And it does that by using an internationally standard basket of goods and services. Okay, good. So therefore, what we're saying is that your choice of income, whether you're using GDP or GNP or GNI, whether you're adjusting for kind of exchange rates or not, and whether you're using, in other words, whether you're using nominal or PPP exchange rates, that's going to make a big difference as the extent to which your income measure is going to be a reliable or useful one for approximating to development.